Welcome to episode 46 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you here from my home in London, or just outside London, but I pretend it's London because that makes me sound more interesting. If you're a new listener, welcome. You have just over 1 hour of relaxed film chat ahead of you. Do check out the other 45 episodes that came before this one. I've really been fortunate enough to have great guests over the last couple of years. From sound and editing legend Walter Murch to most recently Steadicam inventor Garrett Brown. I've enjoyed every one of my conversations with these folks, and I hope you do too. If you're a regular listener, get a hot beverage, cup of tea, cup of coffee, whatever suits you. Sit in your favourite chair, relax for the next hour and 20. If you're driving, stay alert, but take your mind off the rest of life's stresses and just enjoy the journey and enjoy just listening to not me waffling on, but the conversation I'm having with my lovely guest. Give yourself an extra pat on the back if you're a patron on patreon.com/Jamie Benning. That's JamieBenning. There are now 91 of you donating $1 or more per month, which genuinely does enable me to make better episodes. You're now helping to cover the costs of hosting the podcast, as well as helping towards research materials and, paying for my time to do this. This is work, albeit work that I love. So if you are in a position to help support the podcast, please do visit patreon.com/Jamie Benning. Just $12 for 1 year will mean that you help the production of 24 episodes. If you can't afford it, that's cool. Just please share on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook. I'll give you the details of those at the end of the podcast. Okay, so for this episode, my conversation is with VFX guru Craig Barron. Craig started his career in the effects industry as a young man at ILM. You'll love his story about how he got there. You'll hear that in a moment. Years later, he co-founded Matworld, and then he became creative director at Magnopus. Craig co-wrote a wonderful book as well about matte painting called The Invisible Art, along with Mark Cote-Vaz. It's a huge, lavish history of that particular part of the visual effects world and has some of the best reproductions of matte paintings I've ever seen in print. Some of the ones you'll know and ones you won't have seen before, perhaps. It's really worth picking this book up, but if you can find it at an affordable price at the moment, it is out of print, then well done. I found a couple of copies. One was a bit damaged and one's in better condition, so I've managed to sell on the one that was a bit bust, a bit less than I paid for it, unfortunately. But hopefully the person who owns that now is enjoying as much as I have. Oh, and big thanks to Jonathan Banter, known as Agrapher FX on Twitter, for putting me in touch with Craig a few months back. Okay, so here's my chat with VFX creative director Craig Barron, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So, Craig, what sparked your interest in visual effects initially?
Well, I grew up watching movies, going to see a lot of movies like most of my friends did. And I was very interested, of course, in science fiction and fantasy. And of course, this is the pre-Star Wars days of movies. And so there really wasn't a lot of material for, young teenage boys to be excited about in the movies. It was sort of a very challenging time. Now, some great movies were being made in the 60s and 70s, but, it was about a rogue cop that's gone taking justice into his own hands. The Godfather movies, Last Tango in Paris, these are all great movies, but they're not exactly what, a kid wants to see. It's a little above what I was into, of course, at the time. So I'd always sort of been looking backwards a bit at classic movies, which did sort of satisfy this sort of need for seeing adventure in the cinema. And then, of course, the work of Ray Harryhausen. You could always count on Ray for every 2 years to come out with a fantasy movie that had monsters and creatures. And he didn't like monsters. I'm correcting myself. He always would correct me. No, they're not monsters. They're creatures. creatures that would fight and have battles and great visual effect sequences. And then, I would try to emulate that in my garage. I would sort of sculpt little models and set up cameras and do split screens and kind of, very rudimentary kind of visual effects, on my own, because really there wasn't a lot of information about these things, and you would sort of go see these movies over and over again and then try to recreate the feeling you had when seeing them with some of your own work. So, and then of course, people like Lucas and Spielberg started making movies and sort of rediscovering that sort of fun aspect of going back to the movies, which was great for me because that's what I was interested in seeing. So.
And perfect timing by the sound of it. So when you were doing those things in your garage or wherever, how was it? Just pure experimentation, or was there anything to look at? I mean, were there filmmaking magazines that would give away some of the secrets of Harryhausen? I mean, was it commonplace to be able to pick up that kind of information then?
No, very, very little. There's a few things, but I think Cinefex was just getting started. This was sort of before Cinefex, which unfortunately now is not with us anymore. What the interesting sort of thing was, I lived in the Bay Area, but we had family in Los Angeles. So every summer we would go spend summers there or part of our time there. And so I would use that time to sort of explore my interests in filmmaking. And I remember I would go to the ASC clubhouse. The American Society of Cinematographers has a clubhouse in Los Angeles. And, it's not like today, there's no fence around back then. You could just walk in. And they had every American cinematographer, which was a magazine that they published every month about filmmaking from the 20s all the way up to current. And they're still doing it. So I would love to go to the ASC clubhouse and look through those magazines and try to discover something about my favorite films. So I might look up Greg Toland talking about shooting Citizen Kane, or something that was related to the Ten Commandments, a big effects picture for the time. And there were technical articles on those films. And so I enjoyed many hours there reading through those magazines. And occasionally they had cameras there, and they had docents and not really docents, but people that were there that were, cinematographers or perhaps people that could kind of help you and tell you about what's going on. And so they had some cameras. They had VistaVision cameras that they showed me how they worked. And they had a Bell and Howell, what's called a 2709, which was a hand crank camera that Charlie Chaplin used. And they were just very open to anyone who was interested. And so I kind of was able to play with the cameras a little bit, even though it was sort of a museum setting. They were very inspirational in wanting to encourage you. If you visited and showed interest, they took time with you. So that was great. So I had that sort of background of wanting to do this kind of work and then experimenting in my garage. And as I said, starting some stop motion, very, very crude, split screens, me running, being chased by, a plesiosaur, that kind of thing.
Have you still got any of that stuff? Do you keep that, being an archivist yourself?
Yeah, embarrassingly, I have. I do. I teach a course at USC one semester, and I show a few very embarrassing photos of myself just to sort of have a connection with my students, so that it's okay to be kind of geeky about this stuff.
And how did you make that leap to then being employed by George Lucas?
I lived in Berkeley, California, and Star Wars had come out. And of course, that was just amazing. We would sort of, plan the day on how many times we could sit and watch Star Wars before they kicked us out of the theater. So go to the theater and hide during intermission so that you could go see it again. So we sort of knew that Lucas was moving his facility up to the Bay Area. I didn't know where it was, but I knew that he lived in Marin County because I read an article about him in the IJ, which was a local newspaper for Marin. And I sort of hanging out in San Anselmo, and you kind of went to the coffee store, and you could kind of say, well, where is Lucas, and where's that? And it's like, oh, it's up on the hill. He's got a big Victorian mansion up on the hill. And so not knowing that I couldn't, and I just had my stop motion puppets and some film that I did, and I went up to George Lucas's house and went up his driveway, and I just figured, well, I'll just sort of leave my film reel and a note and just say I'm interested in visual effects or something. And so as I was walking up to the house, a FedEx guy was leaving, or UPS, I think it was. And I realized that it was like an office. It really wasn't just his house. His lower floor was his office. And so I went in, there's sort of a center island and a receptionist there. And he lived upstairs, but his offices were downstairs. So I went over and introduced myself, and I said, I'm interested in visual effects. I heard that you're moving the facility up from Los Angeles to Marin County. And Patty Blau was the name of the receptionist, and she said, "Oh, well, you want to go to ILM? This is a business office in Lucas's house. You want to go to? They're down in the canal area of San Rafael, which is like the industrial area." And she said, "I'll phone you a cab." And she was very helpful. It was very nice. And while this was going on, George Lucas walks down the stairs, and Patty's very nice, and she says, "Oh, hey George, come over. This is Craig, and he's interested in visual effects. He has some stop motion puppets and some film, and he wants to go to ILM and talk to them." And George kind of looks at me to say hello, and my throat just contracted. I couldn't say anything. I was just starstruck. I think I coughed. It was so embarrassing. And George then kind of just nodded and went off, and I was just devastated. I thought, oh my God, I'd blown it, I was so embarrassed myself. Couldn't even say hello, And Patty saw all this, and she was so kind. She said, don't worry about that. Go down to ILM and I'll set up a meeting for you. So she called ILM, and she said, George is sending somebody down for an interview, which she just did on her own. And so got in the cab, went into ILM. And when I was there, all the top ILM people were there. Richard Edlin, Dennis Murin, Ralph McQuarrie, Joe Johnson, Jim Bloom, who's a producer, because they thought I was, some big shot or something, because George was this kid down. And so after a while, everybody kind of left the meeting when they realized I was sort of very much in an entry-level position. But Ralph McQuarrie kind of said, well, I kind of need somebody to help me out. I know you're into stop motion, but do you want to come and work in the matte painting department? And I said, yes. Because if somebody asks you if you want to work at ILM, you should say yes. I would have swept the floors. I mean, it didn't matter. I would have said yes to anything. And so I got very close to Ralph over the years. This was on Empire Strikes Back, and Neil Krepla was in the camera department, and eventually Harrison Ellenshaw also came from Disney. And the thing about the first Star Wars is that they didn't really have a matte department set up at ILM. They used the Disney matte department because Harrison did the paintings there at Disney. And there were some things they shot on stage at ILM, but they really didn't have a proper department that could, composite and bring in projection systems and everything that you needed to do to sort of make a classical matte painting department at the time. And so they had to set that all up from scratch. So there was a lot to do. And I was very happy to help do that. And of course, it was this incredible privilege to get close to Ralph. I was living in Berkeley at the time, and I didn't even have a car yet. So I would actually commute with Ralph to work. And so we would have, 30, 45-minute discussions on the way back from work. And he was kind of like, he's sort of an avuncular grandfather, father type figure, and we just got along really well. So I learned a lot from him, and Neil Krepla too is the cameraman in the matte painting department, and so that's how I got started.
And how did your...
And interestingly, though, but to tell you the capper of the story, years and years later, when I was talking to Patty Blau, she's passed away, unfortunately. And I said to her, hey, do you remember that time when you made that call and everything? And she completely forgot all about it. You know, it's just like, she was just such a nice person that's who she was. So it was very kind. So
that's great.
It's good to do good things for people when you can. And I always try to do that as well. So.
Yeah, definitely. And how did your experience and your position develop over the production of The Empire Strikes Back? What were you doing by the end of production?
Well, of course, I was, a painting assistant to Ralph, and then I would also be a camera assistant to Neil as necessary. I kind of bounce back and forth, do whatever needed to be done. So I'm not creatively driving any of this right now. A little bit later, I get into a position of being able to be more of a contribution that way. So I would, literally clean brushes for Ralph, clean his airbrush. I'd prepare canvases, or actually they were glass. They were 2.5 by 6 foot pieces of glass that we would paint on. Not screen doors, by the way. They were custom made for us. There's a little sort of silly thing out there saying that we went to the hardware store and bought a bunch of screen doors. It's like, It's all a bunch of silliness. They were made by shower door companies rather, but they were custom made for us. They weren't just something we bought. Anyway, so anything that needed to be done on the camera side, I also did the color wedging. So, when a painting is painted, you have to match the live action to it through a series of very subtle color changes to get the blend to work correctly. So a lot of times the painting would be finished and it would be an additional week or two just to get the color to be perfect on the live action. And that was actually the most laborious part of it, was trying to get a good color match. Now, of course, it's just incredibly easy digitally because you can select the different color values and bink, it's perfect. But back then, you had to do very subtle changes in wedging. We used to do 128 frame Sinex color wedges, which very subtly changed the values over a range. And after a while, we'd get it as close as we could, or, the schedule was very tight. A lot was going on. We literally walked into a room with nothing in it and built a facility. It was really an amazing time to be a part of that. And, the film was over budget. It was a big problem. George and Gary Kurtz were at conflict sometimes. And George had to sort of go get more money from Bank America. So we would sort of have these tours of bankers coming in while we were working, showing them how the matte department worked, because the matte department was a great kind of destination. The model shop, there's cool things going on there. The matte department always had paintings and things, and it was always sort of a fun visit. And George, loved matte paintings. He is an artist as well. And he really saw it through his process of editing the movies as a way to add pauses or additional kind of descriptions of a scene. And so he really liked having a matte department available to him as part of his creative process. So there were shots that often would be added in post-production, several shots just to sort of help the picture that George would come to us and we would design with him. So that was also really fun. And looking back at this stuff, what I think is kind of unique that I realize now over time is that because I was sort of so friendly with Ralph and our connection, I had much more privy and access to like conversations that were at a much higher level than I normally would have access to. So I was very much sort of aware. I loved it. I mean, because I would talk to Ralph. I think Ralph also sort of saw me as like a young fan that is the market for this movie. And so he would mention things to me if I liked it or not. And that would influence him a bit probably in some of the things that he had later with discussions with George and, Gary and the gang. But the thing was, it was like, I remember vividly when they were sort of talking about, okay, so we're going to see Luke again, and we don't know how powerful he is yet. And, he's in the ice cave and he needs to go for the lightsaber. That whole, I sort of observed that whole process kind of come to light. It was really, the fan side of me now is just delighted to have that sort of memory of it and access to those kinds of thoughts about, and, little things. Did you think that worked? And I was like, yeah, totally. Totally. It's great. Anyway, I'm really sounding geeky here. I'm not.
That's perfect. I mean, you're the sort of double whammy of keen, perfect employee, but fan as well at the same time. So they can tick both boxes.
Yeah, you just revert back to your 16-year-old self.
Yeah.
It's just, you can't help it with these things. And then Kirshner was also really interesting, and Ralph knew Irving Kirshner really well too, so that was good. And then later Richard Marquand. But it was an interesting time because really there was a lot of pressure. Absolutely. I mean, I never worked so hard in my life. I mean, we would work all night sometimes. And it was really hard to get it done on time. But and then when Empire came out, we'd all kind of, it was great, but it wasn't as much considered as much a success as Star Wars was. It was sort of Act Two, and Act Two is where all the fun stuff happens, right? All the drama, and it's more edgy than Star Wars, but it didn't, it didn't feel like it had an arc or conclusion, and so a lot of us at the time kind of said, well, Star Wars was the one who worked on, but in hindsight, I think it's aged really, really well. And now I think it's my favorite. And I think a lot of the fans think it's their favorite too. So I think it's gotten better over time. And again, it just shows you, Lucas's brilliance about it to do the snow battle at the beginning. It's like he put the climax of the film at the beginning to be different. He would do things to be different. And there are so few people now in the industry that can get their way to do things different, that I long for a real director that wants to try to do something disruptive. And it's hard in our current industry to do that. So George gets a lot of credit in my book for trying to be different and trying to do something different. And he's not always successful. There are certainly some failures out there,
for sure.
But he's attempting more so than others would. So I think very appreciative of being able to work for him.
Yeah. You can see how The Empire Strikes Back has resonated through time, can't you? Maybe, as you say, at the time it wasn't quite the huge sea change in terms of those kind of movies returning. But everyone that I know of my generation that loves those movies loves The Empire Strikes Back the most. It's just become one of those movies because I think it, as you say, it has a real depth about it, has an edge, it has an elegance about it as well, and it's wonderful to watch it on the big screen. I hope I'll get the chance to do that again soon. It's been maybe 5 or 6 years, but I was going to ask, working with Ralph, obviously, he's an artist mastermind, a fantastic technician. How much of your conversation with him and working with him, up against these difficult deadlines and everything else. And I think I heard you talk in one interview about a colleague who was unwell towards the end of the production. And, you had to take over some of their responsibilities. How able were you to sort of take in the kind of artistic elements in as much as what matte paintings are for, how they can tell a story and how you can use them in particular ways and for particular reasons?
Yeah, definitely. Ralph taught me a lot about art, and he had a lot of great sort of philosophies about it, and Harrison too. So Harrison comes from a long tradition of matte paintings from the British side, with Percy Day being the grandfather and Peter Allen Shaw, his father. So there's like multiple generations of matte painters. That was a different path than Ralph's background. A traditional matte painting is more about pushing the paint around and getting a more of an impressionistic look of the scene and then tightening it up as necessary. So you would do a series of what we call wedges or film tests. And so the beginning would be blocked out and very crude. And then eventually you put in as much detail as you need, because too much detail actually works against you. Like a lot of times you can see images that resolve more than the live action could. So they are too detailed next to what you could capture. So you have to sort of, work this together. Ralph was from a technical illustrator background. He had worked at Boeing, and back in the day before computer graphics, he would do manuals to show how to, replace electronic equipment on airplanes and what you need to do. And they're very technical illustrations, So he was a master draftsman, could draw amazing lettering and perspective. I think it was Nilo Rodis said that every time he met Ralph, he'd learn something new about perspective. Ralph was just totally consummate. So that was very different than a traditional matte painter. And so Ralph is obviously the production designer, or the concept illustrator is what the title was for Star Wars and Empire. But he also did matte paintings, which he was just such a good artist. He could do matte paintings, right? It's not everybody could, but the subject matter was very technical. The Death Star, the interior of Cloud City, required a lot of technical painting, which Ralph could do. And so he was well suited. And he has some of the best shots in the movie, even though he's not a traditional matte painter. Harrison has great shots in the movie too, but I'm just saying is that it was so unusual that the concept illustrator could conceive the image and then execute it through the matte painting as the same person. We're doing more of that these days, but back then that was very rare. And I particularly like the interior of Cloud City with the weather vanes and the lightsaber fight between Luke and Vader. And you had mentioned before Neil Krepla, who was the camera supervisor at the time. He had appendicitis, so he was out, and I needed to finish that sequence. And I loved it because I loved working with Ralph. And it was done on a system called the front projection matte painting camera. So we would front project live action plates that were photographed in England on the soundstage for us. But I also had to put in the lightsabers because they're fighting. So we were compositing the complete shot out of the matte department that would be cut into the film. So the matte department was the only department that could create finished shots that would be cut into the movie, whereas like the stage would shoot elements to the optical department. The animation department would then, add flak exposures and laser. And then it would be composited in optical. We could also composite shots in and make completed shots. So that was a lot of fun to sort of be able to author the shot with Ralph, And so I remember, I made a color filter for Darth Vader's lightsaber and a blue one for Luke. And then when they cross, a flash element, and we got these elements from animation department and put them together. So it was a lot of fun. And those paintings in particular, they don't really make any sense. Like, what's this big weather vane in a big tube? We call it the weather vane. It never was called the weather vane, but like, did it rotate? Did it stop the airflow? I mean, Ralph, it was just sort of very technical, which is unusual because Ralph usually likes to figure out exactly how everything works. But it just visually works so well. And of course, it had that famous reveal about Luke's father. So it was a great sequence to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's in your book, The Invisible Art, that I've been reading, that somebody described the matte shop as like running a guerrilla unit, because you had that sort of autonomy in as much as you could, you could start with a concept, you could see it through to the end, and then you could produce the final frame and, like you say, do all of those elements. Was there a chance for you to be in dailies at any point and look at those and see them? And what were some of the reactions on those big movies like Empire and Jedi and Raiders?
Yes. Well, I was in dailies. Of course, I had to talk in dailies when Neil had his appendicitis too. And basically what happens in dailies is you present the shot. And it's important to sort of keep talking and to sort of not really filibuster it, but just sort of present it and say, okay, this is where we are now. from last time. We've corrected the color here. We think this is looking pretty good. That kind of stuff. You sort of have to lobby for it so that you can hopefully get it approved and move on. With George, he would tend to approve shots more than we wanted to let them go, because first of all, obviously under a lot of financial pressure to get the film done, but also he knew exactly if it would work because he was editing the film, right, and certainly contributing heavily to the editing of the film. So he would know, I'm going to only use that part anyway. Don't worry about that. So it was great to work with George in that capacity because, you really got the final word immediately right there on what to do. And it didn't have to go through several people, it was just very clear what your direction was. But of course, but I would talk more obviously in Jedi when I was more involved and as a cameraman in the department. We would get up early and look at dailies before dailies and do a preview. And sometimes we would pull shots that were obviously bad, because if you started to present shots that didn't work too much, people would get upset, like, what are they doing back there? So we always wanted to try to put our best foot forward and make sure if we're taking the director's time, George's time, that we have something of value that we're getting from that experience. We don't want to waste his time. If there's something that's obviously not going to work, I would rather not just have George or any director say, well, that's not going to work. It's like, I don't want to take his time away from all the pressure that he or she is under. I want it to be substantive so that it's like, this is what we think works. What do you think? Are we good? What do we need to address? We're recommending you accept this. We'll take this back. We'll work on it a little bit more. It's got to be that kind of professional relationship. If you're just sort of showing a bunch of stuff, you're not doing your job, because they've got so many other things to do that you need to try to make their job as easy as possible as how they deal with you. So anyway, that's just my little philosophy of that. But that's what we did.
It makes sense. It makes sense and also to have that openness where your colleagues can kind of, comment and give you feedback on things as well. I think that's important, isn't it? Because things just don't move forward. If ego is in the way, it kind of ruins the whole process.
We would emulate the Disney sweatbox session, which would be that, we would have our own, well, first of all, we'd have our wedges who we project our wedges and look at our tests, but we would also have screenings and we would all talk about, is this shot working? Is it not? How could it be better? And so there was a esprit de corps for the department. And so a lot of times Ralph would give Harrison ideas or Harrison would give Ralph ideas. And then as the department grew bigger, we kept that going so that we felt like we were getting better. And you can see the work does get better. Like if the work from Empire to Jedi, it's gotten better in Jedi. And it's gotten better in Willow, as far as the arc is concerned, because we're really kind of learning how to do it. And, introducing miniatures as part of the map painting, again, because it's very difficult to do highly technical things like Ralph could do it, but that's a harder thing to do. So we got into experimenting by combining miniatures with the painting as sort of an amalgam of different ideas, to make a stronger shot. And I think that worked really well eventually. But there were a lot of things that we did in Empire, and I think I mentioned this before, that really shouldn't have been map paintings. They were map paintings because they had to be, because of schedule and time, and because the model department didn't have the budget or the ability to create something. So, there's some things in there that I wish we could go back and change. George should go back and change it. But there's some things that I wish could have been a little better. But, I think we did the best we could. And in the context of the movie and the era, it works really well. So we're proud of the work.
Because on Return of the Jedi, there was a gear shift, in as much as I remember seeing that documentary, the BBC Horizon documentary, How to Film the Impossible, where I think there were bits showing effects from Temple of Doom and Return of the Jedi and a bit of Raiders as well. And seeing, I knew what a matte painting was in 1985. I had the books and things, behind the scenes books, but I'd never seen anyone projecting, the live action elements like I could see you guys doing with Chris Evans' matte painting of the Ewok village there, and him kind of scratching paint away to make it fit. And I was kind of blown away by a couple of things. One was that you were doing multiple, live action inserts on those paintings. But the other thing was how, under close examination, they weren't as detailed as I would expect them to be. And you said earlier, of course, that it's more about how that painting reads. There's a bit in that documentary as well about the final scene in Raiders, where we see the guy, with the crate pushing it back into the huge warehouse there. That's a scene that's kind of burnt into people's memories and has been, there's memes of it. I mean, everybody knows that scene. Even if they don't know that scene, they know it being taken off in, I don't know, Family Guy or The Simpsons or something like that. You worked on that scene as well.
Yes. As an assistant, I wasn't as creatively involved in it, but I did a lot of the wedging, the testing. It was very difficult at the time because first of all, it was a very difficult painting because we start really close on the painting and pull back. So the detail had to be, what normally would be 2.5 by 6 on the screen as a painting size, 2.5 by 6 feet, would have to be, maybe only just a couple feet across at the very beginning instead of 6 feet across. So that had to have a lot of extra detail. And it took a long time for Mike Pangrazio did that painting. It was a beautiful painting. But the live action, the way they shot it in England, unfortunately, was that there was a walkway with a gradation on it. And so the light would sort of fall off in a pool of light. And so we had to match that gradation. If it had been a straight tone, we could have matched the tone and then put the gradation in the painting, but we had to match into the gradation. And it just took forever to get that. It took maybe a month to get it. I don't think we ever got it perfect, but all the work then was just painting that little matte line to try to get it just a little bit more magenta or a little less green, just to try to get it just a little bit more perfect. And that shot, again, we composited it in the department because we didn't want the painting to go another generation to put the titles on. So we also put all the titles on.
Oh, wow.
So as the painting fades out, we had to fade out the painting in the live action and then have the titles come up because we didn't want to go another generation just to put the titles on. So we had to do the US titles and then we had to do the foreign titles. And we had to get the match perfect as much as possible each time. So there was a commitment to quality. We were really trying to make it look as good as we could with the tools that were available. You had mentioned the cutting out of the painting and the multiple plates for the Ewok Village stuff on Jedi. And I was more involved in that conceptually, like how to figure out to put the shots together. And that shot's very tricky. If you want to get into it, it's sort of esoteric, but the thing that we did is, you can't put the Ewoks next to bonfires because their costumes are flammable. We can't have any.
Did they, I wonder if they found that out in the redwood forests there. With a few,
we designed the shot. And we said, we can't have them actually near a bonfire like this, so we're going to have to do a visual effect for that. So the thing is, we had completed this big sort of master shot of the Ewok village with Chris up in the trees. And then what we did is that we shot all the Ewoks here on stage at ILM as separate elements. Because this, again, was one of the shots that George added in post-production because he wanted to fill out that sequence. Mm-hmm. So we got on stage and we lined up our Ewoks on blue screen, but didn't have fire there. And then the idea is that we went in with the Automat camera, which was this big motion control camera that we had built to shoot map paintings, which was really an innovation for that time. We would go in and we would photograph something that's maybe about 2 or 3 inches wide on Chris Evans' painting, because that is essentially what we're going to blue screen behind the Ewoks. So these shots came up in dailies. We tried to keep them out of dailies, as I mentioned before, because it causes problems when things come up. So these really brushstrokey, they were very crude because they were only looking at 2 inches or 3 inches across of the actual painting. And so we explained, just It's going to be okay. Please have faith. And so optical then pre-composited those backgrounds behind the Ewoks with fire elements I shot separately as a pre-comp, then gave that as a rear projection composite back in the matte camera. And then Chris Evans cut out the painting and replaced it with the projection of the painting that had been previously photographed and composited into the scene. So it was a way to sandwich our characters actually into the painting. And it worked really, really well. It was a lot of fun to do it that way. I think those Ewok Village shots look pretty good. So they were fun to work on as well. And then we would shoot lots of torches and things. And, we'd try to do things that would add life to what is otherwise a static painting. We're trying to simulate the phenomena of what you would see in nature if something like that was going on out there. So
it's still one of the shots that always sticks in my mind.
Yeah, I'm only sharing that because it's so like, of course, we don't do any of that anymore.
Yeah.
But it was a solution back at the time that worked well.
Yeah. We'll get on to the digital stuff in a moment. I just wanted to kind of ask about post Return of the Jedi, because there was a bit of an exodus from ILM with Dykstra going to, with Apogee and Edlund Boss Films and Phil Tippett at Tippett Studios. And is that when you started to sort of see the potential that you could break away and ultimately end up creating Map World?
Well, I stayed much longer than Richard. ILM was set up. There were sort of two different camps. There was sort of Dennis's team. Dennis came from stop motion background, so he was very much influenced by Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen. I gravitated to that originally, and he was really Dennis is amazing aesthetically and artistically. He's a brilliant cameraman for shooting miniatures, and that sort of whole Walker sequence with painted backings that miniature foregrounds, kind of taking the ideas in King Kong for the sort of dioramas and then updating them with new technology, new lighting. Dennis would do great things like, there would get a single source light source for sunlight. He would take the Fresnel out of the Fresnel is what's in a movie light that culminates the beam. He would take the Fresnel out so that you just get the bright single source of the lamp, which would then make a spectral reflection off the model, so it would look like sunlight. So he was totally into these amazing things that made the miniatures in that sequence look really, really good. And then scrims, we call it bridal veil. So when a bride has a veil in front of her, that material you can buy in large quantities and put in a frame. And if I had one behind me, I could put it behind me and it would just haze out the background without smoke, right? It would just haze it. And so you could add depth of aerial perspective to a miniature without having to shoot it in smoke. And of course, these are stop motion, so you probably couldn't do that very easily anyway. And then you didn't have to breathe all that stuff too, which is great. So I learned a lot from Dennis shooting miniatures, and then we would apply miniatures to the matte painting department as well. So in the case of like when we were doing Willow, we had a lot of castles to do in Willow. Paul Houston by this time was working in our department, and Paul was a cameraman but also a model maker, and he went on to be a very good digital matte painter too. But I wanted him in the department so that we had a model maker with us. And so he built the castles for us as miniatures on the tabletop. We shot those and then did matte paintings to continue the tabletop off into the distance and add the fog and the haze and things like that. So I think it's really helpful to like not just do everything one way, but to sort of add techniques together again to sort of make them more powerful than any individual technique. And, by the time we did Willow, I felt we really, in the matte department, had control over how the shots were going to be put together. Shots that should have been miniatures were then miniatures, and shots that should be in the matte department were in the matte department. Right. Because there's some things, that you said, it really shouldn't have been a matte painting. It was a little too much. And I know, hopefully I'm the only one that's bugged by it, but, it's you do the best you can with the material and resources you have, of course.
Yeah, I think I heard you mention in one interview about that shot of the Millennium Falcon out of the window of the shuttle that, you know, should probably have been a miniature, but at that point probably the set had been struck, and, you know.
Yeah, it was a miniature. I mean that they built a full-size Falcon in London, which they didn't get to shoot. That scene that was added again, that was in edit, you know, post-production, when George wanted a little bit more time. You know, it's like, this is the last time we're going to see the Falcon. We got to have a little moment. You know, it's part of his process of storytelling. And the Falcon just wasn't available. It was on stage, you know, being shot to get the rest of the movie done. So we didn't have access to it and had to paint it. So that's, you know, what you need to do to, you know, please the director and get the movie done. I would say with Cloud City too, Cloud City was painted, and, you know, Ralph could paint Cloud City, and it was amazing that he did it. But that would have been, I think, more effective as a miniature. If we had had a little more time and budget, we might have explored it that way. But we weren't calling the shots back then so much. You know, later, as I said, by the time we got to Willow, we were sort of really felt like we were on top of the best way to do things. And based on experience, right? We could sort of say, this might be better to do it this way because we had this experience. So we could say it'll be more efficient in the end. And it may seem like you're spending a little bit more money now, but you'll save it because it's going to work right. And, you know, you had that voice, and people would let you do that for the most part if you made a good case.
Mm. It's interesting that, you know, you reach that kind of point where you feel like you're getting everything right, and everything that should be a miniature is a miniature, and everything that should be a matte painting is a matte painting, and you are perfecting your techniques. And then you've got this slow creep of computer graphics. When were you first aware that, you know, your world was about to change?
Well, it was a gradual change. You know, Jurassic Park happened, and that was much more, you know, the matte department never had a Jurassic Park per se. You know, that was very clear how, okay, from now on, you know, clearly movie dinosaurs and creatures are going to be done CGI versus animated puppets. Our transition was much more gradual over time. And we had already left ILM by the time we started getting into digital. So ILM was doing some early digital matte painting stuff when I had already left. But I think the thing about Willow, we knew that Willow was going to be our last show together as a department, you know, with Chris Evans and Mike Pangrazio and Caroline Green and Sean Joyce and Frank Ordaz, all the people that we had sort of built the department around. Because George was really kind of getting burnt out, and he really didn't want to run a visual effects company. He was a filmmaker. He wanted to make movies. And after Willow, everyone kind of said, well, I was going to have to sort of change. And a lot of what we were there for was to service George's movie, right? Is to be available to him to make a shot or to satisfy his vision of movie making. And when we changed into a company that had to be, you know, potentially competitive with other companies, that was a different kind of mindset. And so a lot of the things that we sort of wanted to do, we were sort of kind of reevaluated about how we would work with directors and things like that. And we kind of decided maybe it's best if we kind of do our own thing, because Tippett had done that, as you had said. And he seemed to still be able to work with ILM from time to time. And ultimately, we did decide to leave after Willow and form our own company. Mike Pangrazio and I did that. And then Chris Evans came and worked with us later. But eventually, most of the matte guys, Sean Joyce, Caroline Green, all came over and worked with us for a while and went back. And, you know, it was eventually ILM would farm some shots out to us, and that was fine. And so we couldn't get credit for it, which I didn't care. It's just like work is work, you know. So that was fine. But then eventually they started sort of hiring people away from us, and it was got to be a little bit competitive again and not as much fun. But you know, it's just a business. It's it's always challenging, and there's politics. You know, there's always politics, and you just, you know, but what I tell ILM management, if I ever run into them from the time to time, we were all a bunch of young bucks that didn't know anything about leadership or how to run a team. And suddenly we're thrusted in these positions and we're not really that well equipped to do it, and I think that has always sort of been a problem with very creative people, as to how do you also develop the leadership skills to run the team so that everybody has a safe environment that's very creative to work in, and that's also part of the equation to do good work. So even though we had left after Willow, we kind of went back and said, well, you guys actually were doing a pretty good job all those years. We never gave you much credit for it. But that's ultimately, we did go off and form our own company, which, was successful. We had a 27-year run and, the company, I received an Oscar nomination and ultimately an Oscar for 2 films that we worked on there. Yeah, there was a little bit of us and them stuff. That's natural. That's natural competition. But it was that way when we were at ILM. As you said, it was like we had our sort of esprit de corps. George would come in and say, I want a shot. Let's work together. That might make other supervisors kind of jealous. Why is George going to them and not talking to me? There's all these kind of things that kind of come up over time.
Yeah.
And you try to work through them, but nobody's going to tell George not to do whatever he wants. It's his company, right? So but then when George left, things really did kind of change, and it became much more much more production driven, which was what was needed.
Sure. Yeah.
But when you worked for George, it was his company. It was very clear. You could go to George and say, hey, this is not looking too good. Are you okay with this? Or can we offer some suggestions? You always have to can we offer you a suggestion? He may say no, and that's fine. Then you're done. You've done what you needed to do. If he says yes, then you have some ability to discuss it further. It's really about how you help the director fulfill the vision. And, that's your job.
Great to have the possibility to even do that. I love that little story about the sort of little operation like the Sting, where you faked like a production facility to kind of win over HBO, which I know in your book.
That part in the book, yeah.
Yeah, which you said in the book you still feel bad about to this day, but I think my listeners would love to hear that.
Well, and I'm sorry the book is out of print. This would be a wonderful advertisement for book sales right now. But the book went out of print. I'm hoping to do a revised version someday, but I have to have time to do it. And it's unfortunate that the book is still not in print, because it's like the hardback on eBay is going for $500 or something. The paperbacks are still reasonable, but so when we left ILM, we were sort of looking at the films that were coming up. There was another Indiana Jones, and it was sort of like, okay, Indy's hanging on a cliff again. Well, we did that. We've done that, And a lot of taking a step back, a lot of the idea for it came back because the map department ILM had smaller shows it was working on separately from ILM. So like Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, sometimes Barry Levinson would want to come to us and have some shots from his movie. And it was very difficult for ILM to accommodate that, because they needed to keep the entire facility working. And this is like after Willow, part of sort of the issue is that there were lots of shows that we could have done in the department, but it didn't support the stage. It didn't support the optical department. And so they needed us working on another Indiana Jones sequel that would keep the whole facility working. So we hated that, because when we had our own little projects, on Labyrinth, Jim Henson would call me after the shoot. He would be working in London. He would call at the end of his day, which was 6 or 5 in the morning, my time. But I was happy to take the call because it's working with Jim Henson, and he would give me his notes, and it was great. So we had this ability to sort of provide a service to filmmakers that weren't necessarily doing the next, big epic summer tentpole. And we just really felt that was so disappointing for us, because it really helped us to expand our abilities to be filmmakers, to understand how to work with different types of filmmakers who relied on us more than the big machine, right? Where you're a little cog in the wheel. So we ended up seeing so much work turned down that eventually producers kind of came to us and said, hey, if you guys ever want to go freelance, we'll send some work your way. And so that was sort of also another motivation for doing it. And so there was this HBO project called By Dawn's Early Light. And that was sort of like the last of the fail-safe Dr. Strangelove movies. And HBO at the time was trying to get into domestic feature production for their channel, and then they would release theatrically in Europe. So you would work on a film that would be released theatrically, but then home domestic. And we had done some work for the producer before, and so we said, okay, well, we'll do your show, and we'd like to set it up. And so we get this call. We get, it's weeks bidding back and forth and stuff, and then they finally say, okay, great, and the executives are coming next week as a confidence builder to see that you can handle this job, because it was a fair amount of, it was 150 shots, miniature airplanes, what happens if the nukes get loose between the Russians and the Americans, kind of stuff. And so we were like, our facility, yeah, right. Okay, so we rented a warehouse, and it was not that shocking because that's what we did at ILM. And we rented a bunch of equipment, and we borrowed some miniatures from John Goodson, who's a model maker. And we made it look like we were a little facility, but it was all kind of an illusion. It was sort of an illusion on an illusion, And it was before cell phones, so we really sweated on putting telephone service into our space, because we knew the executives would come in and take a phone call immediately or want to make a call. And so we got the phone hooked up, and we didn't even have all the power we needed because it wasn't set up to run lights. So we borrowed power from next door through extension cords. We would take this gets esoteric, but we take a 4-plex Edison power plug, hot glue it to the wall, and then plug things into it. And it's just a prop, none of it worked. And so we came in, we had the production meeting. We had done this art to say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we would approach it. We had nice, high quality miniatures that were available, professionally created. This is the quality we're going to do for you. And we had the meeting, and we had people just there pretending they were busy. Someone was calling every 5 minutes to answer the phone. So the secretary was answering the phone. People were setting up lights, doing whatever it would look like. And so after all this happened, we had our meeting, everything's great. They're all happy. They're leaving. They're going off to have a nice lunch someplace. And we all stop, and we kind of like applaud and whoop and holler. And then the guy comes back in to use the phone while we're all like caught like deers in the headlight, like time had stopped. And then we all pretended to be working again, and he didn't notice. But I thought we had blown it. I thought I was like, oh God, no, we've blown it. But I did feel a little guilty about that. But, we knew we could do the work. It was just a matter of getting the opportunity. And ultimately, we did all win Emmys in visual effects for the show. So I felt justified that we were the right people to do it, and we did a good job for them. So it was okay. But it was a little bit sneaky at the beginning, but it all worked out.
I mean, even if you've been caught, if I was that executive, I'd be saying, they've got the common sense to do this. They've got the hustle to get it together. They've got the artistry to make the illusion. It's all the things.
Well, fortunately, we never had to have that conversation. Yeah. it just worked out. But and then that's how we started our company, Matt World. And as I said, we had a good run. And there was sort of a time in the 80s when we were sort of the go-to company for doing matte painting work. And then it was really on Batman Returns we started to realize that that other facilities were doing more editing of paintings. And Richard Hollander, I think, I talked to him a lot about his company and how they were diving into computer graphics. And then ILM, of course, had done something. The problem, of course, was that the quality of the scans were 8-bit scans, and they didn't have a lot of high dynamic range. So we tried to do some compositing, some digital compositing with the matte paintings on Batman Returns, for example, and they didn't look good because the bit depth wasn't there to do a nice gradation, because a lot of what we were doing were light falling off on the sides of buildings going up to darkness, and that looked real spotty because there wasn't enough dynamic range to make a complex transition. So we ended up going back and doing some traditional opticals. In fact, we went back to ILM and they did traditional opticals for us because they were still doing opticals. And we would work together. We would rent a VistaVision camera from ILM. If they needed help, we would try to help them as well with anything they needed. But it was about that time that we kind of realized we had to start getting into it. And then CineSight, which was Kodak's Cineon process, which was 10-bit log, was a beautiful capture medium. And at that time, Kodak was providing services. So we just built it into our budgets as a scanning cost. Whatever the cost is, we're going to send that to CineSight instead of having our own scanning department in-house, because that was just too expensive, and the technology changed so quick that it didn't make sense to do that unless you were a huge facility. But at this point, we're sort of a custom matte painting environment creation house, and so we had a lot of producers sort of carve off our stuff and have other people do other things. So Star Trek, Ralph Winter, producer with Harve Bennett on the Star Trek movies. By the time we did The Undiscovered Country, Ralph had just taken the matte shots and given them to us, even though ILM did all the rest of the work, the stage work. So we had a good, reputation. It's what we wanted to excel in. We built tools that were custom to what a matte painter needed to do good work. We did a lot of stuff with matching lenses and scanning lenses and matching plates so that we could do match move and tracking and things like that. So we had a lot of color pipeline work that we did to make the painting and color look consistent. And in fact, when we worked on Zodiac with David Fincher, he did the DI at Warner's, and they used our lookup tables for. We made the lookup tables for the show because they look so good that he said, "Hey, this is what I need to see what I want my daily to look like." So we had that color stuff down because that was our interest. This is the area that we needed to make sure was correct. So we did that whole transition of sort of going through traditional film scanning, then direct digital source, and then eventually digital rendering, and eventually the whole industry changed that way. So
yeah, I was going to mention Zodiac because I think that was one of the first films that I kind of watched without any knowledge of there being effects in it at all.
There's a lot of effects in it.
Yeah, there are. I remember seeing that effects reel some years later and just kind of going, I've seen that film like 3 times. I had no idea. How did direct? I recently spoke to Garrett Brown, the guy who invented the Steadicam, of course, and he was talking about how
Met him on Jedi, of course.
We
did the Steadicam through, and I didn't work on that sequence directly, but that was a brilliant approach of and then there's an interesting story behind that because David Fincher was working for Cordy Films at the time, and he wanted to rent a Steadicam to do some effects work, and he was asking me about it, and I was saying, Dave, I can't tell you anything about it because this is this big secret that we had Garrett Brown doing this. And so eventually David came over and worked in the matte department with me. And it was he, and I went to Dennis. I said, David figured out this whole thing and no one told him anything. I just want you to know this. He thought about floating cameras for visual effects work, just so you know, I didn't tell him. But David was brilliant, and he would often run the night crew. with me. And he liked that because he could do his own thing. Again, we were sort of, this is so sad. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but occasionally, they wouldn't call us the Matt department. They would call us the Brat department, because we were all kids back there kind of doing our thing. And so we would go off, and David was ultimately then when he became a director, I had a good relationship with him and did Zodiac and Benjamin Button for him. And it worked out really well. We had, really good, obviously, relationship. And David liked to use matte paintings in the same way that Lucas likes to use matte paintings as story bridges. And it was a very positive. We had 2 back-to-back shows, which was really great because we went right from Zodiac into Willow. We were using the digital Viper camera, so we had all the color worked out, and it was a very, very pleasing, easy transition just to have those 2 shows. And I think that was some of our best work that Matt World Digital did was in Zodiac and Benjamin Button.
Yeah,
because of that relationship. Yeah,
the thing I was going to mention about Garrett is that he talks about how the success of the Steadicam, apart from it being an amazing invention, was those directors who kind of took it on board and saw what it could do. And I was even surprised to see the work that you did on Casino. I had no idea that was an effects shot with the Tangiers Casino and everything there. How did Martin Scorsese kind of deal with working with emerging technologies? And how much trust was he able to put in it, and how much, trust were you able to put in yourselves to produce it for a director like that?
Well, I loved biblical epics, old classic movies. And I heard that Marty was doing Last Temptation of Christ. And I thought, okay, maybe there's some matte paintings of Rome or something. Maybe there's an establishing shot of Rome that's it. And so at that time I was ILM, and I contacted him through his production company. And they were very nice. They said, no, this is a really low budget. We don't really have anything that it's more sort of a handheld, people gathering, and it's not big epic in the sense that a classic movie was, but they thanked me for my interest. And I kind of forgot about it. And a couple of weeks later, I get a call from Thelma Schoonmaker, who's Marty's editor, and said, well, we have some shots we need. I said, great. What do you need? And so, well, we need a lion in the desert because Jesus finds a lion in the desert. We couldn't get the lion, and, it didn't work out. So I did some early shots for Last Temptation, and I said, well, do we want the lion talking? Because that was very difficult back then. It was sort of pre-digital or just about digital. In Willow, we had very early processes for animation. And so they said, no, we don't have the lion talking, but we do need the lion. And so we, on the stage, we got to sequence, and we laid out a sand-covered desert at night, single source lighting, backing, and we rented the lion from Africa, USA, which is a safari park nearby. And we put the lion in, and we were able to line up the shot so that it looked like the lion comes in out of the darkness and stuff. And so they accepted all those shots. They were happy to have them. And so we started a relationship with Scorsese. And then when I had left ILM and we had heard the Casino was starting up, I read that it took place back in the 70s, and a lot of Las Vegas doesn't exist anymore. So we reapproached them through their production designer, Dante Ferretti. And since we had done a good job for them, on Last Temptation, we got that job. And the idea of recreating those sort of neon signs that with thermometer up and down, and a lot of that had been torn down. The Dunes Hotel had been torn down. The Tangiers, which we created, was fictitious. So it was actually a repurposing of an older casino that sort of had this kind of dish with lights under it. It looked very unfinished. And so with Dante Ferretti, we said, well, what if we kind of make this look more like a turban, like a sultan's turban with continue the lights up. We designed the shot, and he liked that. And we said, well, we thought, well, we could do it as neon miniatures, kind of like the way One from the Heart was done. They had all these nice miniatures, and we even talked about renting those miniatures from One from the Heart. If you remember that opening sequence, they fly through Las Vegas, and they made these beautiful, I know they're like 4 feet, 5 feet high models that are all beautiful neon that they could animate. But we kind of said, no, we need to get into the digital stuff, and we need to know that we can do this. And I had read, my parents both worked for the University of California. My dad is a sort of a research scientist, and so we always had Scientific American around. And I read about global illumination techniques, or the attempt in computer graphics to simulate more real-world lighting than, let's say, conventional gaming engines, or, well, they didn't have engines in the classical sense, but in the sense of computer graphics trying to be more of a visionary tool for, say, what an architect is going to build a building, what the lighting might look like in reality, so that they could design it properly, so that the lighting instruments inside the CGI world would be photometrically and photogrammically correct. They would actually emit 1,000 lights or lumens of light in the environment. And then that light, if it's being emitted, does it bounce off of anything? Is it affecting other surfaces in the environment? Is there indirect illumination that's being described versus just direct illumination? And so global illumination techniques take all this into account. We approached a bunch of students that were working at Cornell University, and they were getting their doctorates on this radiosity and direct lighting stuff. The math comes from air conditioning ducts. I don't know exactly. It has something to do with cooling air conditioning, and they applied it to visualization. And they were creating this architectural rendering program for architects. And I said, well, we would really like to take this and apply it to film. Can we, which wasn't set up to do that. We want to animate within it, not just render one frame, but we want to do a series of frames. And so they were excited about that. And so we said, okay, we're going to use this new technology to render Las Vegas at night, because it's all about surfaces reflecting light at night. And so we thought, if we could accurately recreate that, shoot the light, and get a real world representation of what light really does in a real world environment in our computer graphics simulation, we thought it would give it the realism that was lacking from computer graphic shots at the time. And so it worked really, really well. And it took forever. I think if you saw some interview before, I sort of had to call, Scorsese's office and say, it's going to be good. It's looking really good, but it's taking a long time to render. We actually went to SGI, and they helped us finish the shot. They were like shocked what we were doing, and we had shot it with Cineon in VistaVision, and we were crazy because the file sizes were like 80 megabytes a frame, and we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know. We just did it. We just did it as good as we could. We just tried to make it look as good as possible. And so we eventually got the shot finished. We were very excited about it. We took it over to ILM and showed Dennis Murin, and we went to their daily theater. We wanted to see it on the big screen. We see things on monitors, and we had a small projection room, but we wanted to see it on the big screen to see if there was any. So we invited Dennis over and some of the gang, and we just said, can we just watch it a few times? It just blew us away. It was just really great because so much effort went into it, and it took so long to render, but it was really describing lighting in a realistic way in a CGI environment. And so we were very proud of it. And I didn't know that at the time. That's when I came back. We were just studying it. But literally, I had to bring the shot to Scorsese and see it with him for the first time, not having seen the final version. I saw some tests, and he accepted it as a take one final, and which is good because it would have taken us months to do it again if we wanted to change. But the thing about Scorsese is when he hires you, every director is different, but when he hires you, again, he is into this. Okay, I've hired you because I think you're good at what you do. So if you're going to bring me something, you have thought about it and you're presenting it to me and you're asking me to accept it. And he will accept it unless there's some technical thing that wasn't discussed or some problem that he sees that you don't see. So he was very much, we had lots of take one finals in working with Scorsese, because that caliber of filmmaker, it's not so much them searching for some kind of solution. You know, I mean, when I worked on a Marvel movie, I think we did like 100 takes, and it's not getting any better, really. We say, we have a term, it says you're improving this shot into a failure. You know, it just kills it after a while, you know. And people get, you know, obsessed with one little thing, and they're not looking at the rest of the picture, which is what everyone else is looking at, you know. And that's sort of really an unfortunate problem with visual effects production, which is adding a tremendous amount to the expense and burnout factor, is that directors who really know what they're doing know when things work and can work with you. And sometimes everything has to be perfect, and I think it hurts it in the end. So anyway, that's just, I mean, Phil Tippett talks about this much more than I do, much more eloquently from his standpoint. But I think that we do sort of the people that worked had the privilege of working in visual effects in the 80s and 90s sort of had a different, it wasn't as institutionalized. And so you had more access to the director, to the actual filmmakers making the movie or working with you, versus sort of notes being handed down by a visual effects supervisor several times. And then there's the unfortunate situations sometimes when the visual effects supervisor is out of step with what the director wants. And then that's a challenge to please the director and the visual effects supervisor. And sometimes the director comes to you directly, and then that's awkward. So, you know, it's a difficult area, and it's different every time. And you have to find the best way to work with the production based on, you know, the people that are there and their levels and abilities.
As one kind of final point, I guess, because I'm aware it's been an hour and a half now. You talked about, you know, having the privilege of working in the industry, you know, and seeing the transition and everything else. How important do you think it is for people in the industry or beginning in the industry to have some kind of understanding of the history? Because I know that's a kind of hobby of yours, and Ben Burt's as well. You look back at some of these old movies that you love, and I've seen some of your amazing deconstructions of how those early effects work where there was no record of them. How important do you think that is for people to kind of understand?
Well, it's kind of a leading question. You know, I'm going to answer. Well, I think the thing is that there are people that have innate artistic talent and ability, and who are incredible. And I'm not one of those persons. You know, I sort of need to be influenced by things. I tell my students this at USC, is that the silent era, silent films, while they may seem boring to many people, they're all about telling stories through images. And that's what we do as visual effects artists. We tell stories and communicate ideas through image, not dialogue. Dialogue is not our area. We're not screenwriters. We're storytellers through visual content. And so to see movies that only communicate visually is really a great training tool for learning how to have a vocabulary. And so when you sit with a director or a filmmaker, you want to kind of come to them at their level. You know, they don't want to hear that the alpha channel is not pre-multiplied and that's why this is bad or anything. That doesn't matter. It's really more about the story. Every shot in narrative cinema is there to advance the story, right? It has a reason to be there. And what is the reason that it's there? And if you can't articulate what that reason is, then maybe that shot shouldn't even be there. And so we kind of see big effect sequences with, you know, 6 different cuts of the same thing. And you're kind of like, one cut might have been fine, you know? And so what is the real core value to what you're doing? And what is the idea that you're trying to convey to the audience? And if you lose track of that, then I think you're not being effective in what you're trying to achieve. So I think seeing classic movies that are effective and that tell great stories help you to say, okay, I might have done it a little bit differently, but I see what they did. Or I see what they did, and it could have been better if maybe they did this, But to have that kind of conversation is training. And you want to do that before coming to the table. You want to do that with a vocabulary. I've always said, like when we go to design meetings, let's say if we're sitting down with the director and we're looking at a shot and we're suggesting a design, we give 3 different examples of a great shot, 3 different ideas based on, say, what the script says, based on any conversations you've had with the director. And he or she will pick one of those, and probably something from column B also,
Mm-hmm.
And then it's an amalgam of that discussion, which makes something even better, right? The interpretation of what you're doing through the director, taking it further than what you brought to the table, but having a satisfying artistic experience for everyone involved. And we've signed off on the concept, and now we have a plan to go forward and we can execute it. And that is the way to work professionally. That's the way to be good at what you do. And if you don't have a plan, it's a lot of searching and, well, maybe we'll try it this way. And now we have animatics to replace some of that. It doesn't really matter, but it's just sort of like wanting to build on a relationship based on being part of the filmmaking process is getting lost, which is the challenge right now. And so I think it's a matter of really learning your craft through watching movies and expressing your ideas through film. And I think people interested in this work can look at movies and say, hey, well, that shot didn't work too well. Why not? And I think I'll do a shot and cut that into that movie and do a different shot. Like that's an amazing thing to be able to think about, that you can kind of draw from all this history and be there to sort of see what's important, and so that's kind of hard it's hard to get that training right now because there's so many teams of people doing things that, we're into specialization so much. And it's also hard to apprentice. Like I could apprentice with Ralph McQuarrie. It's much harder to apprentice with somebody, right now. So it's challenging, but not impossible. I mean, the result, the evidence is that there's a lot of amazing work being done today. And so it's possible to do great work. It's about how to get there. And hopefully that makes it a satisfying experience to be in this industry. We're not good in this industry of documenting our history. And so thank you for your efforts to do that. I think it's vitally important to have a sense of creative achievement and identifying this as an art form, not just a service, but something that is creative and celebrate its achievement.
Perfect. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Craig Barron there. Lovely guy. I hope to have him back on the podcast to do a part 2, which we've kind of discussed on email, because we didn't even have time to talk about half of his fascinating work. So hopefully that will come in the future at some point. Coming up on the podcast, I have the senior visual effects consultant at DNEG, namely Paul Franklin. I was lucky enough to be invited to DNEG's offices in London by Paul to talk about his amazing career and working with many of the big directors, most notably with Chris Nolan on Inception and Interstellar. It really was so nice to chat to him, such a lovely man. That will be coming up as the next episode in March 2022. And then just today I went back into London to chat with Sara Virani. She's the partnerships and marketing manager at Regent Street Cinema. Okay, full disclosure here, full transparency. I was invited there and kindly offered some free tickets for a screening, which I haven't taken them up on yet. I just wanted to say that up front, but nothing I say in that podcast, when you hear it and in that interview, is untruthful or in any way swayed by the fact that I have free tickets. I'm not that cheap. Because looking into it, actually, I realized that it was a really interesting history that cinema had. A really historically important cinema in London. You'll hear why when the podcast is released next month in March 2022. It was also a good excuse for me to try out a different style of podcast, recording at a location and in person again, which I really enjoyed. So my last two were in person, all safe, all COVID safe and everything, but just nice to be out in the world. I look forward to hearing your feedback on all of these episodes. Keep the support coming at patreon.com/Jamie Benning. If you can't afford to do so, please just leave a review on Apple Podcasts or retweet on Twitter. I'm at JamieSWB. Or like and comment on Instagram at Filmumentaries, or the same name on Facebook as well. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.